Hello to everyone watching and welcome to the next in our series of short videos looking at employment law issues arising out of the pandemic. I'm Emily Moore and I'm here with my colleague Sara Ibrahim. Hi Sara.
Hi Emily.
And today we are talking about furlough fraud. So in this video we're covering what furlough fraud might involve and HMRC's approach to tackling it. And we'll then follow this up with a further short video looking at what companies should do in the event that mistakes have been made when claiming under the scheme. So as everyone knows by now that the scheme is coming to an end this month. We're recording this video at the end of October, and it paid 80% of the wages of workers placed on leave since March, up to a maximum of £2,500 per month. And now we're in the situation where thousands of businesses are under investigation for either falsely or mistakenly claiming. So Sara, what do we currently know about the potential scale of furlough fraud?
Well, Emily, I think you're touching upon a very important point there. And the scale we're looking at is in the region of 3.5 billion in payments that may have been claimed fraudulently. This is a huge amount of money, even if you look at the amounts the government has been handing out during this pandemic period. To give you more of an idea, since the beginning of September, HMRC told MPs who sit on the Public Accounts Committee it estimates that 5 to 10% of furlough cash has been wrongly awarded. So that's a huge amount of money. And this 5 to 10%, they reckon, ranges from deliberate fraud all the way through to error. Now, this estimate needs to be heavily caveated and potentially qualified because it's based on the best available comparisons with grants and benefit systems, for example, tax credits. But with tax credits, we need to take into account it's a much more established system than what we had here with the furlough scheme. Now, at the point that HMRC gave this evidence, about 8,000 calls have been received to their fraud telephone hotline, and they were looking into 27,000 high-risk cases where they believe there had been a serious error made in the amount an employer had claimed. This number has probably increased because we're talking about 2 months on from that. I mean, Emily, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think those numbers are obviously really staggering, aren't they? But I suppose it's not really that surprising given the speed with which the scheme was rolled out to provide a much needed lifeline as quickly as possible when the lockdown began. And that kind of sudden introduction made it very vulnerable to both mistakes and scams, I'd imagine.
So Emily, I'm wondering if you could talk us through what types of fraud HMRC are looking at.
So Sara, I've sort of come up with 4 main areas of conduct that might amount to furlough fraud. So the first is the creation of so-called ghost workers, or sort of claiming in respect of staff who've actually left the business. And secondly, claiming whilst individuals were actually working as normal or on a part-time basis or as so-called volunteers. And thirdly, there's making backdated claims to include time when individuals were actually working. And fourthly, there's the example of asking staff to take a pay cut beyond 80% whilst still claiming the maximum furlough grant. And I just wanted to also briefly mention, there was some interesting research commissioned by the legal rights app Lawyer, and those results were released back in June. And that showed that 36% of employees on furlough were under pressure from their employer to continue working for them. So employees were reporting that they were still working as volunteers or still checking work emails. And out of 2,000 furloughed employees interviewed, 27% were asked to send and respond to emails, 17% were asked to make phone calls, 12% were pressured to attend their physical workplace, and 11% to volunteer their time. So I think that's quite interesting. A small number of employees, just 2,000. It's quite striking nonetheless. So Sara, what do we currently know about the approach that HMRC will be taking when it comes to suspected furlough fraud?
Well, there's actually been an interesting statement made by HMRC's permanent secretary, who's Hare, and I'll read this just to get it so it's accurate, Jim Hare said, what we have said in our risk assessment is we are not going to set out to try to find employers who have made legitimate mistakes in compiling their claims, because this is obviously something new that everybody had to get to grips with in a very difficult time. Also, we will expect employers to check their claims and repay any excess amounts. What we will be focusing on is tackling abuse and fraud. So Emily, that tackles a lot of the points that you were raising. They're not looking at mistakes, they are going to be focusing on fraud. And in that vein, HMRC has promised to crack down, and we have already seen some pretty high profile arrests. So in July, for an amount of just under £500,000 of furlough fraud, there was an arrest. And in September, 2 London-based directors were arrested for £70,000 worth of furlough fraud. So HMRC are already taking action. Now, if you are found guilty of making fraudulent applications, the individuals involved can face tough criminal sanctions, including a fine and a potential criminal term. Now, if you're looking at an offence under the Fraud Act, that criminal penalty term could be up to 10 years, so a very long term there. Emily, do you know anything further that we should take into account about HMRC's approach?
Just a couple of further points, Sara. So I thought it was worth mentioning that HMRC has information and inspection powers, meaning that they can perform spot checks and compel the disclosure of information. And also another comment made by Jim Hare is that HMRC will be writing to employers to give them the chance to correct mistaken claims and repay excess amounts sort of before taking more drastic action. And finally, whilst HMRC can't get involved in any relationships between employers and employees, they can and will reclaim any grant that the employer is not entitled to. So including, for example, grants that haven't been passed on in wages to employees. And Sara, I think you were going to make a quick point about whistleblowing as well.
Very much so, because whistleblowing is being encouraged by HMRC. So when you have instances where an employee feels their employer may have been fraudulently claiming, and you touched upon some of the examples earlier, then they are being told that they can report this to HMRC. Now, there are a couple of ways they can do that. There is a form on the website, and we'll provide the link along with this video, but you can also call HMRC up by telephone. Now, what the website tells us is the individual does not have to give any personal details. And even if they do decide to give details, they're going to remain confidential. The other point that HMRC makes is that individuals should not try and find out more about the fraud. So you're not being encouraged to undertake an investigation yourself, and that is very important. So they're also told not to tell anyone that they have made a report. So HMRC has been very helpful there in setting out some parameters for people who may wish to be whistleblowers.
Great, well, thank you very much, Sara. I think that concludes our first video, and we'll follow up with a second video on genuine mistakes.
Thank you, Emily.